Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined by Barry Malone. Great to have you back.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
I am doing very well. Stephen's off today, so I've been sort of scurrying around trying to get all the stories together. But we have a nice collection coming up for our viewers. Lots of China today, which I'm pleased about. We're going to begin with the spy story, and then I speak to a brilliant analyst on the trade war between China and the United States. We'll then move on to what I think will be quite an interesting conversation about the ethics of taking money from Gulf monarchs. And we're going to end on a story about ChatGPT. As you're probably aware, £1 trillion they have gathered in investment into infrastructure. And apparently lots of that is going to go into making porn bots. You couldn't make it up. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support to let us know your comments throughout the show. Keir Starmer has today announced that key witness statements that led to the collapse of a China spy trial will be published. The issue dominated Prime Minister's questions today. We'll show you a clip of that in a moment. First, though, some background. In case you haven't been following this story, which is blowing up in the newspapers, but might have gone under your radar. It begins in March 2023. That's when Christopher Cash, who was at the time a researcher to then chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Kearns, and Christopher Berry, who's an academic, were arrested. They were alleged to have broken the Official Secrets Act. Both men have consistently maintained their innocence. But in September last year, they were both charged. This is from The Times about that case. So they say the allegations involve obtaining, collecting, recording, publishing, or communicating notes, documents, or information which might be or intended to be directly or indirectly useful to an enemy. Sounds fairly serious. According to the Crown Prosecution Service, a, quote, senior member of the CCP and a Politburo member, believed to be one of Chinese Premier Xi Jinping's closest advisors, Kai Chi, had received politically sensitive information from two accused British researchers. And the Times goes on to report this. This was deemed prejudicial to the safety or interests of the UK because the information they passed on was directly or indirectly useful to the Chinese state. Among the material passed to Kai is understood to have been details of a Foreign Affairs Committee delegation to Taiwan in November 2022. This is thought to have included information about the hotel and even the room numbers of where the MPs, including Kearns, were staying. Kai, a Xi protégé, is the fifth-ranking member of the 7-man Politburo and a director of the CCP's General Office, making him de facto chief of staff to Xi. You'd have thought they'd be able to get that information from the hotel in question, but there we are. The trial of Cash and Berry had been due to start at Woolwich Crown Court in London last Monday, but suddenly, in mid-September, the case collapsed. That was after the CPS said they were unable to proceed with the charges. Now, that was despite, according to The Times, security services and senior police officers being confident the case was a, quote, slam dunk. So why was it dropped? The truth is we don't really know. It's unclear. Some details are coming out. The director of the Crown Prosecution Service, Steve Parkinson, though, has pointed the finger at Keir Starmer's government. He said that because the government repeatedly failed to label China a threat to national security in witness statements provided to the prosecution, the case would have failed. And that's because charges against the two men stipulate that the country getting the intelligence must be an enemy. So the Crown Prosecution Service couldn't establish China was an enemy or a threat or whatever word they needed. And so the case collapsed. Kemi Badenoch struggling politically, but she saw an opportunity here to go on the attack.
Two men have been accused of spying on MPs in this very building. The CPS had what it felt was a clear and compelling case to prosecute. But the trial has collapsed because for months and months, the government has been refusing to give the CPS vital information. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This looks like a deliberate decision to collapse the case and curry favor with the regime in China.
Curry favor with the regime in China. How dare he? Keir Starmer in response has said the case collapsed because the Tories, when they were in government, had not classed China as a threat, which was when the alleged spying took place. So he's saying nothing to do with him. Today, he said he would publish in full the witness statements by the Deputy National Security Advisor that led to the collapse of the case. Just saying, we're going to make this all public. This will become clear. Kemi Badenoch, though, wasn't impressed.
It is simply unbelievable. It is simply unbelievable that he is trying to say the last government did not classify China as a threat. So I will refresh his memory. In 2021, the previous government's integrated review described China as the biggest state-based threat to the UK's economic security. In 2024, the Minister for Security said from that dispatch box that China poses a threat. But let's leave aside the government. In 2022, the Director General of MI5 in November classified China as a threat in his remarks. How is it possible that the government failed to provide the evidence that the CPS needed to prosecute?
The substantive evidence was provided in 2023 by the previous government. That is when the witness statement was submitted. I am going to disclose it. They will all be able to read it. The substantive evidence was written and disclosed and submitted in 2023 under the last government.
So he's saying when people read the witness statements, they'll recognise it's not his fault or the fault of his government. Now, Keir Starmer has said he hadn't read those witness statements until this morning. So he's made this announcement after reading the witness statements, which one can sort of presume means that he thinks they're more incriminating for the Tories than they are for him. And there's also an element of the whole row which seems dishonest, because when Badenoch couldn't see any political advantage to being a China hawk, she took a very different stance to the one she's taking now. The New Statesman today has a piece titled, Kemi Badenoch is pretending to be tough on China. And they've gone into the archives and report this. Badenoch was asked by Sky News in September 2023 whether China should be described as a foe. She preferred the word challenge. After all, as she put it, China is a country we do a lot of business with. Badenoch fretted that we shouldn't be using language that makes people scared. During a topical questions debate that month, Badenoch refused a request by Labour MP Barry Shearman to conduct a thorough audit into Chinese influence over the economy. I do not think we need an audit, said Badenoch, 2 years before she became Westminster's most enthusiastic spy catcher. So this is her quote, China is our fourth largest export market and we are aware of the economic challenge that it poses across the world. We work with countries across the world, but we have a pragmatic relationship with China. We need to use our influence to help them get to a better place. But I take the honourable gentleman's point. The idea that the British have much influence with the Chinese when it comes to how they run their country seems a little bit far-fetched. Barry, when it comes to these stories, I'm sort of never really sure how to approach them sort of emotionally, morally. Obviously, sort of the press is outraged that the government hasn't been tough enough on China. I think it probably makes quite a lot of sense to try and curry favour with the world's second largest economy, which is probably going to at some point become the first. Yes, lots of things about that government I don't like, but more predictable than Donald Trump. And we never hear scandals about the Americans having too much information about us because we give that to them freely. I suppose at the same time, as a country, you probably do want to punish people accused of spying. Obviously, these guys deny it, but the case hasn't collapsed because they've been shown to be innocent just because, the UK government can't get its story straight on how we approach the Chinese. What's your take on this?
It's great to have a spy story, isn't it? Bit of a change to the news, and not just a hacking one, but, a John le Carré information being passed to a shadowy diplomat at the embassy story. I think you're right to say that there's a lot we sort of don't know yet about this. And I think some of it has been quite confusing. I was intrigued the last few days as it was being reported in this use of terminology, whether you had to, whether the UK government had to formally say that China was an enemy or whether it was a threat. The thing is, there is no formal designation. It's not as if the UK government designates some countries as enemies and some countries as threats and some countries as challenges. And that's some kind of a formal process. The use of the language is scattered across many different kinds of documents. It might be something that comes out from the Foreign Office. It might be something that comes out from the DOD. It might be something that comes out, as Badenoch referenced, the integrated review of security. And I had a look at a couple of those documents. and the Integrated Review of Security, which came out in 2021 and was updated in 2023, it does kind of describe China as a threat. Badenoch had picked one quote from it in which it's the strongest statement that China is a threat. So she's right that that's there. Then there was something that came out under the Starmer government in July that was called the Strategic Defense Review, and that called China a sophisticated and persistent challenge. So, both the Tories and Labour have used very careful and deliberate language when referring to the nature of their relationship with China. But it's really intriguing that the CPS seems to believe that it needs to prove, because of the Official Status Act, that the information was given to an official enemy of the UK or a threat to the UK's national security. And if there is no formal designation, then, I kind of get where the CPS is coming from. If there is no formal designation, then surely the only way that they can prove that the information was passed to an enemy or a threat to national security is if some arm of the government confirms to them that that is how China is considered. And so I think that there is a lot that's unknown here. But at Prime Minister's questions today, Badenoch gave it a good go, but I felt like Starmer did okay. I felt like there was a sort of a confidence about him, as you say, that when he releases these documents, which I believe are interviews that were conducted with the Deputy National Security Advisor, that it will show something that, as you say, favors his government and reflects unfavorably on the Tories. So whether it's that the Deputy National Security Advisor refused to categorize China that way when he was interviewed under the Tories, that would be a good punt. I think the other thing that I wanted to say about sort of spying is, countries spying each other, and they know that, and, they try and combat it, but to some extent, right, they accept it. China spies on the UK, and the UK spies on China. And I think that, every country expects that when somebody is found to have been spying, that they will have been prosecuted, or that they will be prosecuted. So when you look at sort of Badenoch's accusation that, the government deliberately wanted the case to fall apart so as not to upset China, I find that a little bit far-fetched, given it's such a sort of standard practice to prosecute people who are accused of spying, unless, and again, this is pure speculation, but Badenoch is forcing me into it, unless they want to collapse the trial because something would come out in the trial that would somehow threaten national security or the UK's relationship with China. So yeah, an intriguing story, but I think we got to wait and see what's in these documents that Starmer is going to release.
Yeah, so as I say all the time on this show, I'm not a lawyer. But the way this makes sense to me, because you'd have thought that sort of spying for anyone, if you give information from the state to a different country, shouldn't really matter if they're an enemy or not. It's presumably something you're not supposed to do, right? Even if you give it to France, probably you shouldn't do that without telling your superior if you work for the state. But I suppose the way I'm making sense of this is presumably if you give any kind of state secret, so sort of classified information to anyone, that would be illegal. So if you gave sort of highly classified information to France, presumably you're not supposed to do that because it's highly classified. But if presumably these guys, I would imagine, gave something short of, well, alleged to, obviously they deny it completely. But in a situation like this, I imagine that you've given to the country something which falls short of like highly classified information. So then you need to have this higher threshold of the state is an enemy, and Britain can't decide whether or not to call China an enemy. Just for legal reasons, I should repeat that these guys absolutely deny they've done anything wrong and haven't been found guilty of anything. Of course, the case has been dropped. You talked about careful language, Barry. Someone who's not keen on careful language is Dominic Cummings, and he has jumped on this story. He's told the Times that in the late 2010s, China stole classified state secrets from the UK and that the civil service covered it up. So he said the Chinese government had accessed documents classified as strap. That's the first time I'd heard of this phrase, but it's the highest classification for state secrets. He says that this breach of state secrets was revealed to him and Boris Johnson when they entered number 10. And these are the somewhat colourful quotes he's given to the Times. So he says, the cabinet secretary said, "We have to explain something. There's been a serious problem." And he talked through what this was. And it was so bizarre that not just Boris, a few people in the room were looking around like this. Am I somehow misunderstanding what he's saying? Because it sounds effing crazy. What I'm saying is that some strap stuff was compromised and vast amounts of data classified as extremely secret and extremely dangerous for any foreign entity to control was compromised. Material from intelligence services, material from the National Security Secretariat in the Cabinet Office, things the government has to keep secret. If they're not secret, then there are very, very serious implications for it. So Cummings then said the civil servants in the Cabinet Office warned everyone that to talk about this breach would be illegal. So his vision of the civil service is just that they're covering stuff up all the time, and they just scare people. They scare politicians not to talk about it by saying that it will be illegal if you talk about this. So let's all just be very quiet, hush, hush. Cummings, as you'd imagine, also very scathing about the spy case collapsing. So he says, anyone who has been read in at a high level with the intelligence services on China knows that the word threat doesn't even begin to cover it. He says the degree of penetration in espionage, in all kinds of operations, penetration of critical national infrastructure, theft of intellectual property, the whole range of things is absolutely extraordinary, 100 times worse than it is in the public domain. Everybody who has been briefed on the critical analysis of these things from the intelligence services knows this is true. The idea that it is somehow a difficult semantic question of whether to define them as a threat or how much of a threat is absolutely puerile nonsense. And everybody in the heart of Whitehall knows this. He has an explanation, though, about why politicians and civil servants won't be explicit about China being a threat and sort of tend to just cover up when they're spying on the government. And he says this, the answer was there's been a political choice made in this country to prioritize Chinese money over security against China. Strong Whitehall forces are desperate for Chinese money. Barry, your thoughts on this? It's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose depending on sort of like the political side that someone has, like if this was about Saudi Arabia, like you could imagine this being something that like left wingers are furious about because it's China. It's more like right wingers who are furious about it. The idea that the state would make a political choice to prioritize Chinese money over security against China, should that worry us? I mean, presumably we don't want foreign actors to get all of the government's databases, but
no,
what do you think about this?
No, I mean, it's an extraordinary interview, as Dominic Cummings often gives. But I don't find any of that particularly surprising that, that there would be a breach and that the government would keep that quiet. I don't think that, it's the kind of thing that any government really would go public with unless it was forced to, or unless, as happened in this case, there's a prosecution. And in terms of, putting money first, that's just realpolitik, isn't it? I think there's actually a lot of people in the country who would accept that and understand that. But of course, that's never something that governments are sort of openly honest about. But again, am I surprised by that? No, not at all.
The China-US trade war is increasingly difficult to follow, and that's because the dispute, with multi-billion-dollar consequences, is being directed by an angry man armed with a smartphone. And on Tuesday night, he tweeted this. This is Donald Trump on Truth Social. I believe that China purposefully not buying our soybeans and causing difficulty for our soybean farmers is an economically hostile act. We are considering terminating business with China having to do with cooking oil and other elements of trade as retribution. As an example, we can easily produce cooking oil ourselves. We don't need to purchase it from China. Now, of course, it's going to be further from the kind of trade war pursued by Joe Biden. He wanted to limit exports of the most advanced chips to stop China overtaking the United States in artificial intelligence and other frontier sectors. So it's basically sort of about national security. Trump instead wants to cripple their manufacturers of cooking oil. Not what I thought was a strategic sector, but there you go. So how did we get here? Well, you'll remember back in April, Donald Trump imposed a 145% tariff on Chinese exports after a tit-for-tat escalation. Now, after a mini stock market crash, which you'll remember, Trump ultimately went on to reverse that move, pausing the tariffs and entering into negotiations. People said taco, Trump always chickens out. I mean, things had seemed relatively calm since then until Friday night.
President Trump says the U.S. is imposing an additional 100% tariff on imports from China starting November 1st. Today's announcement follows heavy losses on the stock market. The sell-off was triggered by an earlier threat from the president to unveil a massive increase of tariffs on China.
The decision to impose 100% tariffs on China followed China announcing export controls on rare earths. So China processes around 90% of the world's rare earth metals, which go into everything from solar panels to smartphones. So this was read by the Trump administration as Beijing flexing its muscles. But Trump's response to sort of say, well, fine, two can play this game. I'm going to put 100% tariffs on you. That hit the stock markets again. And by Sunday, again, Trump rolled back his threats. So he took to Truth Social and said, don't worry about China, it'll all be fine. Highly respected President Xi just had a bad moment. He doesn't want depression for his country, and neither do I. The US wants to help China, not hurt it. President DJT. So what the hell is going on? As I say, lots of money, lots of livelihoods on the line. Well, earlier today, I spoke to Kyle Chan. He's a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton, whose high-capacity Substack covers tech policy and US-China competition.
So I think what happened is China was setting up an export control system for rare earths that I think was mainly about building up leverage and having this capability in the run-up to a Xi-Trump meeting and a larger deal between the U.S. and China. What's key here is I don't think China intended this to be seen as an actual implementation of these export controls right away. But they were interpreted as such. So I think from the Trump administration standpoint, these were seen as not like preparations, what was it called? Sort of like preparing for a plan. These were seen as an actual escalatory move on China's side. And so that's why I think Trump and then later, Bessent sort of talked about putting on these harsh tariffs, hitting back hard, potentially. And they also put, Trump also put sort of a timeline on that. So it wasn't immediate. It was to put pressure on China. But then you have a walking back of these things. So we can get into that. But I think already from the very beginning, we have a misunderstanding between the two sides. I don't think it was Beijing's immediate goal to hit the U.S. with these controls per se. I think they're preparing the groundwork for that kind of leverage.
Can you explain why rare earths matter? I mean, I think some of our audience will have heard of them as sort of these valuable metals which might be used in smartphones or AirPods or the like. But sort of, what are they, and why does this provide China with leverage?
China has a lot of control over the production of rare earths. So, as I say, rare earths are not so rare, but they're very hard to process and separate and purify and get into a form that's usable. And a lot of that processing capability, especially for heavy rare earths, is really controlled by China. And rare earths, they go into a whole range of products, materials that sort of underpin a lot of our modern technology. You mentioned smartphones, earbuds, anything with that relies on sort of a small but very strong magnet to, say, do acoustics or to operate controls in a car. So the auto industry is heavily reliant on rare earths, as is the defense industrial base in many countries like the U.S. And in particular, they're reliant on rare earths from China. So cutting these off or restricting their exports would have wide-ranging effects on a huge number of industries.
And I just want to get your thoughts on a clip. So this is Scott Bessent speaking to CNBC earlier today about what happened with China's rare earth export controls.
This is clearly something that they were planning all along. I think that things can de-escalate, that we don't want to have to escalate. We have things that are more powerful than the rare earth export controls that the Chinese want to put on. And sir, to be clear, this is China versus the world. It's not a U.S.-China problem. Good news is that this is IMF week. A lot of my counterpart, or all my counterparts, are here. We're going to be speaking with our European allies, with Australia, with Canada, with India, and the Asian democracies. And we're going to have a fulsome group response to this, because bureaucrats in China cannot manage the supply chain or the manufacturing process for the rest of the world.
To begin with, the idea that this is China against the world. So China he was repeating a similar thing in the Financial Times yesterday as well, I think, sort of saying this is China threatening the whole world to bring it all down by putting these export controls on rare earths. I mean, is there any element of truth to what he's saying?
I think what's interesting is both the US and China are trying to frame this issue in their own way. So to a certain extent, he is right in the sense that these rare earth export controls do impact a lot more countries than just the United States. European auto industry, India has been affected. So yes, in that sense, that is true. But I think what's really key is framing sort of who is the global disruptor here. And it's sort of funny that you have Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent trying to paint China as the one that is overturning sort of like this tenuous truce and holding sort of the rest of the world hostage, as it were, or at least the global manufacturing hostage. And from the Chinese side, I think they are trying to frame this as a defensive measure in response to the US's erratic behavior and disruption of the global trade system and the US-China relationship. So already here you have sort of dueling narratives about, who's really the bad guy and who's actually in support of preserving, global order and stability.
I mean, another thing that was interesting in that is Scott Bessent sort of saying, and I suppose you would say this if you're the US Treasury Secretary, but he was essentially saying, we've got bigger guns than them, essentially. We've got more leverage. We can do more damage to them than they can do by limiting exports of rare earths. And what's the truth there? So as far as I understand it, sort of the US's big leverage is when it comes to AI chips. So the United States, via NVIDIA, does control the most advanced chips, which China does want. China seems to think, unless I'm mistaken, that its sort of biggest leverage is with rare earths. Is this now just a sort of a game of poker where we work out which is more important to the global economy, chips or rare earths?
Yeah, so on the rhetorical level, both sides are trying to frame themselves as having the upper hand. Trump likes to talk about having all the cards, and how I think it was actually Scott Bessent earlier at the beginning of sort of Liberation Day escalations when he said that China has like a pair of twos and the US has a much stronger hand. So both are trying to portray themselves as having escalation dominance, and especially in the US case, the US is trying to portray China as being in a very vulnerable state, where the Chinese economy is suffering from a prolonged, real estate slump, and really can't handle, say, very high tariffs that would impact the economy, maybe even threaten political stability in China. This is sort of the rhetoric coming out of the US side. And the reality is that overall, this is sort of like a little bit of a mutually assured destruction scenario, where the two economies are so intertwined and so embedded in the global economy. They both are reliant on each other's supply chains, that it really is sort of like like what's the opposite of a positive sum? Like a negative sum scenario. It can get worse for everyone. Specifically, though, I think what is interesting is both sides are prepared differently for these sort of actions from the other party, and the impacts are different. So China has been preparing for a long time for building up its semiconductor supply chain, trying to build up its own AI chip production capabilities, and trying to basically make itself less reliant on U.S. technology. And to a certain extent, they are making progress. The U.S., on the other hand, knowing the risks of these rare earth export controls, going all the way back to when China used something similar with Japan in 2010, the U.S. hasn't really stepped up and tried to build its own kind of resilience. And rare earths impacts not just sort of the AI chips of tomorrow, but the manufacturing, the automotive industry, and the defense industrial base of today. So there is a different kind of urgency, I think, with the Chinese actions against the U.S.
And I suppose that's, so as far as I understand it, no one really wants to make rare earths because they're very environmentally damaging, so it takes up a lot of space. And so, Biden, I suppose, with the CHIPS Act, he wanted to reshore sort of high-value factories, for example. But I don't think he thought, let's reshore the production of rare earths because, as you said earlier, they're not actually rare. The reason not many people produce them is because it's very energy intensive, creates lots of pollution and the like, and only China is really willing to do that. So I suppose in the short term, mutually assured destruction. In the longer term, is it the case that more countries will begin to produce rare earths, even though it's not a particularly sort of attractive industry to get involved in?
Yeah, I think a lot of countries are going to face hard choices. Many countries, like the United States, they don't want the kind of environmental degradation that comes with rare earths mining and processing. Also, there needs to be an investment on the other side, on the sort of human capital, the technology to do this kind of processing. It's not sort of just purely about the environmental costs, but altogether, it would take quite a bit of effort, not just from the United States, but from multiple countries, all facing kind of similar risks. You think about how Japan tried to work with Australia when they faced a similar situation before. So you can imagine a broader coalition potentially of countries, although of course that coalition is tougher to build and maintain in an era of high tariffs coming out of the US.
Let's end on the story from today, which I have to say I haven't got my head around at all. Soybeans and cooking oil. Why have they suddenly been brought into this trade war?
So soybeans were really key in the first trade war during the first Trump administration, where in order to retaliate against U.S. tariffs on China, China began to try to find a way to hit Trump where it hurt. So, just matching tariffs alone might not do it, especially given that, as Trump has pointed out many times himself, China sells a lot more to the US than vice versa. But soybeans would affect farmers in rural areas, maybe in red states or red districts that had supported Trump. And in the past, there have been efforts from the US side to support or sort of backstop financially these farmers, and there are questions about whether that will happen again. But this is sort of a way to have more targeted leverage from the Chinese side. And I think it's sort of ironic that then from the US response to that is to talk about cooking oil, given that out of all things, that is really sort of beside the point.
So the soybeans, that was China that was political in a way, wasn't it? Because they were saying, we're going to hit Trump supporters, essentially. Trump, with cooking oil, is saying that the US is going to start making its own cooking oil. I just don't get it, because I mean, that's not going to scare the Chinese government, is it? That they're not going to be able to export as much cooking oil as they could before. Is he hoping that will sort of be a boon to his supporters in rural areas because they can now make more money from processing cooking oil, or is he just confused?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all confused here, and the bigger picture here is, I think that Trump is now being careful about retaliating. So before, he came out sort of guns blazing, calling for 100% tariffs additional on top of the existing tariffs on China, trying to hit back hard to what he perceived as a really tough measure from China on the rare earths. But in this case, it seems like not just Trump, but also the Chinese side are a bit more careful about how hard they're hitting. And I think that both sides have a strong interest in having this summit between the two leaders and trying to work out a deal. Going back to our earlier sort of discussion, there is a kind of mutually assured destruction, and there is sort of a mutual benefit here if they can find a path forward. And I think that both sides, despite all the rhetoric and bombast and throwing of tariff figures or cooking oil tariffs at each other, I think ultimately there is some kind of pull from both parties to make a deal.
That was Carl Chan speaking to me earlier today. Thank you to Carl for helping me understand why Trump is tweeting about soybeans today. Piers Morgan is famously a big advocate for free speech, but evidently he's also more than happy to take money from Saudi Arabia, where criticism of the monarchy or Islam is against the law.
I was delighted to take part in the Real Estate Forum 2025. It was an impeccably organised and superbly staged event that delivered real value. That's exactly why I decided to return for a second year. RFF 2026 will be the first major gathering since the important new law which allows non-Saudis to own real estate in the kingdom. It's going to be a vital platform for leading companies, investors and experts to connect and discuss the future of global real estate. My sincere thanks to the organisers for inviting me back again. I look forward to joining you at RFF 2026.
Now, I think that's quite embarrassing for someone who sort of claims to be a serious journalist. We're sort of used to hearing it on like YouTube shows and podcasts where someone says something which you can imagine they were paid to say, right? I'm not sure he wrote the entire script. Maybe he did. But I did find it jarring the way he's implying he's just going back because it was so enjoyable the last time. It was brilliant. So I was so glad to be invited because I want to go to this really brilliant real estate selling event in this sort of Arab monarchy. Presumably, the reason he's keen is because I would imagine they pay quite well. Again, doing it on the set of his YouTube show, I think cheapens the journalistic credibility of that outfit, if it had any already. And obviously, this fits into an aggressive campaign by the Saudis to broaden their appeal in the West. Just 2 weeks ago, that included the very controversial Riyadh Comedy Festival, which managed to draw in some of the world's most famous comedians, reportedly with seven-figure payments for some. Once again, the festival managed to sort of draw in people who've very publicly complained about cancel culture and limits to free speech, like Dave Chappelle, Jimmy Carr, and Louis C.K. In response to these stars performing, Human Rights Watch highlighted how the Saudi regime had recently been on an execution spree to crush dissent and people speaking out about what they believe. Now, they highlighted two cases in particular. So they say, on June the 14th this year, the Saudi government executed Turku al-Jasser, a prominent Saudi writer and journalist, for various terrorist crimes. So that's in brackets, of course, not brackets in quote marks. And the government has released few details about his detention, trial and execution. And it appears he faced capital punishment because of his peaceful speech and commentary. They say in February 2024, Saudi authorities executed Abdullah al-Shamri, a Saudi political analyst specializing in Turkey, based on charges including threatening the stability and endangering the security of Saudi Arabia. Al-Shamri met regularly with journalists from prominent news outlets and had appeared as a political commentator on television. Barry, obviously these comedians got a lot of criticism for going to Saudi Arabia to take part in this comedy festival, getting paid lots of money, given that telling jokes about the royal family in Saudi Arabia is illegal, and these are often sort of comedians who've made a big deal out of the fact that they believe in free speech and they're getting cancelled because people are saying mean things about them on Twitter when they sort of make a joke about a minority. I haven't seen so much pushback for Piers Morgan. I mean, that video on Twitter did get quite a lot of views, but I was expecting loads of people to be really furious about it. And he seems to have gotten away with it. It seems to have gone under the radar. What do you think?
Well, yeah, for me, it's just a question of hypocrisy. I do want to say that I do think that there sometimes is a little bit of hypocrisy in the West towards countries in the Arab world or authoritarian regimes where you say, well, how could you take money from this government? But, it's completely fine to take money from the US government that is supporting a genocide in Gaza right now. But putting that aside, I think that, again, yes, it's about hypocrisy. The Saudi government is, for my money, one of the nastiest governments in the world. Last week, we had the 7th anniversary of the killing and dismembering of the journalist and dissident Jamal al-Khashoggi. And let's remember the extreme nature of that killing, where the man was lured into an embassy where basically a hit squad were waiting, who attacked him and chopped him up with a bone saw. I mean, this is the kind of government that we're dealing with. They execute opponents. They have executed opponents for years, and they continue to execute opponents. I think they're the 3rd most prolific country for putting people to death. And yes, Piers Morgan sets himself up as some kind of a champion of free speech. The hypocrisy there is absolutely glaring. And, you know, I do think that he deserves more scrutiny for it. And I do think that he should be made to answer questions about it. I will say that when it comes to the sports washing, I believe he did do an interview with the Saudi sports minister earlier this year, in which he asked him some tough questions. You know, he asked him about freedom of expression. He asked him whether, you know, their moves into football and their moves into boxing were attempts to burnish their image, etc. But, you know, he does an interview that I'm sure he would probably show as an example that he is willing to hold them to account. But then he takes their coin to go and do this event. And like you said, I'm sure it's a really, really nice amount of money. Same with the comedians. I don't think I've ever seen a comedy festival with a lineup of that level of comedians, you know, comedians of that fame all on one bill. Again, you can only imagine that serious money was thrown at them. So yeah, for me, it's about hypocrisy. Look, if you're a free speech warrior, if you talk about cancel culture, and then in the next breath, you go and take money from a country that puts critics to death, then yeah, it's wildly hypocritical.
And I suppose to avoid us being seen as hypocrites, I wanted to get your thoughts on something, because I suppose I took money last week from Al Jazeera because I appeared on one of their shows to talk about Keir Starmer and British politics. You were an editor there. Qatar is another Gulf monarchy. They've got no democracy. We believe in democracy. They don't have it. I don't think it's a particularly great place to be LGBT, for example. Do we have a leg to stand on to criticize Piers Morgan or Dave Chappelle if we've been involved in Al Jazeera, say?
Well, people can criticize us for working for Al Jazeera, and they do daily criticize me on Twitter for that and call me a hypocrite. But, you know, Al Jazeera is a state-funded broadcaster, and I've always maintained that it's a state-funded broadcaster in much the way that the BBC is a state-funded broadcaster. I know that the BBC loves to, you know, draw a distinction between being a state-funded broadcaster and a public broadcaster. You know, we're not funded by the state, we're funded by the British public. Yeah, because it's illegal for the British public not to pay the license fee. It's not like they're voluntarily paying it out of the goodness of their heart. Therefore, it's state-funded in the same way as Al Jazeera is state-funded. BBC is Ofcom regulated. Al Jazeera, not many people know, is also Ofcom regulated. So I think as a journalist, you need to look at whether the news organization that is state-funded actually holds that state to account. And I think that the probably the biggest human rights criticism that you can make of Qatar is the treatment of migrant workers there over the years, and you know, particularly in the run up to the World Cup, when there were major infrastructure projects underway and the construction of the stadiums. And when I worked at Al Jazeera, we covered that. Similarly, you know, you would hold the BBC to a similar standard. Does the BBC hold the British government to account? A lot of people would say that they do, and they do so very effectively. And I think a lot of people would say that they don't. And a lot of people would point to the coverage of Israel, for example, of Israel's genocide in Gaza as an example of how the BBC toes the British government line. So, yeah, again, I think the key issue with Piers Morgan and the key issue with the comedians is the hypocrisy and the fact that the Saudi regime is clearly one of the nastiest in the world and anti-free speech to the degree that it puts people to death for criticizing the government.
Yeah, I suppose I would just want, like, out of interest, I suppose, because I'm, I'm keen on Al Jazeera, but I'm interested in sort of how it works on the inside. Because my understanding is, and I suppose I'll put out my position as well, to be fair, which is I think Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera English sort of is good for media plurality, because I think that sort of it's good to have that perspective on Middle East politics being streamed. I actually do find that sometimes when I go on there, they really not want to, because that would be maybe overstating it, but I don't like going on there and sort of saying, oh, Keir Starmer's terrible because he's so harsh about migrants, etc. Because I do feel a bit like, well, the country that's paying for this broadcast is not very good to migrants either. So, like, I feel a bit awkward doing that. But I do think that on the whole, it's good for media plurality to have it, and the journalistic standards are obviously much higher than, say, Russia Today, for example. It doesn't feel like just a propaganda channel. It feels like the information is high quality and they employ good journalists.
Well, the proof is in the pudding, Michael. The proof is in the pudding. Switch on Al Jazeera English, go to aljazeera.com, and you will see an incredibly high standard of journalism. And I think that news journalists around the world recognize that. And I think that sometimes when, you'll see Al Jazeera being criticized by particular governments, you'll see journalists come out from across the spectrum, not just Al Jazeera journalists, but journalists who work at Reuters or AP or other places will come out and say, no, we actually respect the level of journalism that comes out of there. And yeah, unlike other state-funded channels like Russia Today or like Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera English is Ofcom regulated, and there have been complaints made to Ofcom about Al Jazeera. There was one about a documentary that Al Jazeera made on the Israeli lobby, and there were many, many complaints made to Ofcom about that documentary. Not a single one of them was upheld. So I think that, people just need to go and look at the level of journalism that it produces. And I think that a lot of people who criticize it do not read the journalism, do not watch the channel, just reflexively criticize it because it's funded by Qatar.
Are you allowed to criticize Qatar on it, though? Because you said my understanding had been that it's good on international politics, but the limit is you're not really allowed to talk about what's going on in Qatar. But maybe that's incorrect.
Well, you can. I mean, if you go on the Al Jazeera English website and search for Qatar, you're going to find a bunch of stories about migrant workers. I think that there is an element of self-censorship sometimes, where people are afraid that if they report too harshly in Qatar, they might rock the boat. But I often find or have found that self-censorship that you find from some journalists there is not necessarily valid. That when you do report on Qatar, generally, you have the freedom to do so. And again, I don't think that that's necessarily different from organizations like the BBC, where I think people also self-censor for an easy life. And I think that at any news organization worth its salt is full of journalists who will push back against any perceived biases that they might worry about at a senior level. And certainly Al Jazeera is a company or a news organization full of journalists who push back against their editors every single day. I can also point to an interview that Mehdi Hassan, when he was with Al Jazeera, did with the Qatari foreign minister, in which he put him massively under the cosh. So it's certainly not the case that Al Jazeera is banned from covering Qatar in a negative way.
That's very interesting. I like this comment from Mr. Squinty Mint. If you want to learn the truth about your own country, quite often you have to go to foreign broadcasters. I do think it is handy, actually, that sort of now British people or people from any country can more easily see what other people think of them or what other people think of the policies that their government have. I think sort of like I think maybe it would have been harder to go to the war in Iraq if as many people watched Al Jazeera back in 2003 as they do now, because it probably would have given people a different perspective. Maybe that's overstating the importance of these things, but I don't think it's a ridiculous sort of hypothesis to put forward. I'm always in favor of watching lots of different things. I always tell, don't just watch Novara Media, by the way. Watch Novara Media, watch some right-wing YouTubers, watch the BBC, watch Al Jazeera. As I say, I don't think Russia Today is particularly valuable, but watch lots of different things is I think, the best way to get a good media diet, and read as well. Sam Altman and OpenAI talk a big talk They say the technology they're rolling out could transform society for the better. It could cure deadly diseases and perhaps make work obsolete. And that story has brought in tons of money. In recent weeks, the company has signed up to a number of deals valued at an astonishing $1 trillion. Now, these deals with companies like Oracle, NVIDIA, and AMD will allow the company to invest in the computing power they say they'll need to reach AGI, or artificial general intelligence. And Sam Altman, just last week, laid out some noble outcomes these massive investments might achieve.
My own personal equivalent of the Turing test has always been when AI can do science. That is always that is a real change to the world. And for the first time with GPT-5, we are seeing these little examples where it's happening. You see these things on Twitter. It made this novel math discovery and did this small thing in my physics research, my biology research. And everything we see is that that's going to go much further. So in 2 years, I think the models will be doing bigger chunks of science and making important discoveries. And that is a crazy thing. That will have a significant impact on the world. I am a believer that to a first order, scientific progress is what makes the world better over time. And if we're about to have a lot more of that, that's a big change.
Now, that sounds great. I'm all for curing cancer. Surprise, though. OpenAI has attracted $1 trillion in private investment, and they need to prove they can get a return on that investment, right? And how do tech companies make money? It's not by investing all their time in trying to cure cancer. No, they steal our attention. That's how they get the big bucks. That's how you're going to pay back those investors, is stealing our attention, getting us to use more and more of their product, to spend more time staring at ChatGPT. And on Tuesday night, Sam Altman, I think, really surprised no one when he tweeted some updates to ChatGPT. So this is the first part of the tweet from Sam Altman. So he said, "We made ChatGPT pretty restrictive to make sure we were being careful with mental health issues." Of course, it's a company associated with being careful. "We realized this made it less useful, enjoyable to many users who had no mental health problems. But given the seriousness of the issue, we wanted to get this right. Now that we have been able to mitigate the serious mental health issues and have new tools, we are going to be able to safely relax the restrictions in most cases. In a few weeks, we plan to put out a new version of ChatGPT that allows people to have a personality that behaves more like what they liked about 4.0. We hope it will be better. If you want your ChatGPT to respond in a very human-like way, or use a ton of emoji, or act like a friend, ChatGPT should do it, but only if you want it, not because we are usage maxing." It's this way of the way he's very tweet. Obviously, you can trust us. We're not trying to get you to just spend as much time as possible on ChatGPT. We don't even want you to use ChatGPT very much. We just want you to have a really good, interesting, fulfilling life. Yes, we believe you, Sam Altman. Of course, the background here, if you remember, is people going into these psychotic episodes because ChatGPT had told them that their deluded ideas were brilliant, and that actually they were the only person who could see that we were really living in the matrix, and that they should cut out any association they have with their family because their family don't know the truth and only you know the truth. And this led to some really difficult situations as people suing OpenAI for what they allege is its role in the suicide of people, because this has driven people crazy. I think those probably are extreme cases. I think much more likely, if you make it speak to you in this very human-like way, is that people will develop relationships with this instead of real humans, and that has all different kinds of problems with it. This was all just a prelude, though, because the real announcement in this tweet from Sam Altman in terms of how this company is going to make money, that's obviously not how he phrased it, but how I interpreted it, was this. In December, as we roll out age gating more fully, and as part of our treat adult users like adults principle, we will allow even more, you guessed it, erotica for verified adults. Barry, I think we could see this coming, but is $1 trillion being invested into a glamorized porn bot?
$1 trillion porn bot, the mind boggles. Some men will never leave their houses again. I mean, no, I'm not surprised. It was always heading in this direction, wasn't it? Because, do we remember that OpenAI started as a non-profit? That seems like a really long time ago, and it really isn't. But this is what it's always been about. It's always been about money. And as you say, the money that's been invested in OpenAI and in other companies is huge. It's mind-boggling amounts of money. And so far, not only have they shown no return on investment, but they don't seem to have much of a roadmap towards return on investment. They had all these lofty claims. They're going to cure cancer. They're going to solve climate change. They're going to replace 90% of knowledge work. Altman said that the invention of AI was comparable to the invention of electricity. And, those of us who use ChatGPT, I confess I do sometimes, know that it hallucinates all the time. It makes things up. Sometimes it can't seem to do basic maths. I mean, it's a long way from curing cancer and solving climate change. And so now I think they're looking to make money. They're looking to find a way to reassure their investors, because talk of a bubble is growing and growing. Personally, I think it is a bubble. I think it looks a lot like a bubble, given the amount of money that we're seeing invested. A bubble bigger than the crypto bubble, a bubble bigger than the metaverse bubble. I think that this, has all the hallmarks of potentially being a bubble as disastrous as the .com one in the mid-90s. And you're absolutely right. It's all about attention. It's all about engagement. They want people to use it more. They want people to pay for subscriptions. And what better way than with this really, I actually think, dystopian scheme to have people, because they won't just be consuming porn, they'll be building what they think are relationships with an AI. And, I'm sure many people have seen the movie Her, which now seems quite prescient, but I think that's really, really scary. I don't want to sound like a Luddite, but I'm finding myself increasingly anti-AI. I'm developing a visceral loathing for generative AI. But then you have much scarier things going on, like, we've got whatever about OpenAI introducing porn, OpenAI making deals with the US military, or Palantir making deals with the British Army. They're really scary potential directions that AI can go in. So I hope it's a bubble. And I hope that the investors lose their shirts so that this AI race will stop before it has incredibly negative impacts on the world.
Yeah, I mean, I, as I say all the time on the show, I differ with the people who say this is all, nonsense, AI, it's all a scam. I think that the technology behind this is transformative and is going to be revolutionary. And it might well at some point cure cancer. I don't dismiss that possibility. I think it's very much possible. But I think what we're seeing now is what actually Sam Altman said a few years ago. He was saying that AI is going to be such a powerful technology that it shouldn't be left in the hands of private individuals. And lo and behold, he's got some power, he's got some money. Maybe he was lying all along, to be honest, actually, because I think that's quite possible. But he now is sort of the epitome of what happens when you do concentrate power over AI in the hands of a profit-hungry private individual. Because, if this had been public investment or something along those lines, then we could pour this money in and say, please focus on curing the cancer. Or even, private tutors for young people. I use AI when I'm sort of reading a bit of text and I'm saying, I don't quite understand this. Can you sort of explain it to me? And then it does break it down quite well. I do it instead of Google searches, actually. I always make sure I check it before I put it in a script. You can ask it. You can say, you have to give me, a link to all of these things, and that does make it a bit more disciplined, makes it less likely to hallucinate. But it is like having, another researcher. It's useful. I think that the technology is phenomenal, actually. But if it's controlled by a powerful tech billionaire or tech company who is desperate to get back as much profit, as much revenue as possible, then the energy is not going to be driven towards curing cancer or private tuition. It's going to be towards stealing our attention. And yes, porn, right? And what you do, if you're desperate for quick bucks, what do you turn to? Porn, which seems to be the position we're in already with OpenAI. This was supposed to be the company that would be the guardian of this important, valuable new technology and not debase it immediately, not use it just for exploitation and for manipulation, but it seems like we're immediately going in that direction. And I mean, I've seen lots of people say this, and I think it's true. If Sam Altman really thought we were going to get to AGI sort of very quickly, the kind of technology that would replace all work and would cure all of these diseases, I think he probably would hold out a little bit longer before going for the porn bot. So probably, I'm probably extending my timeline a bit for something along the lines of AGI because of this and a couple of other things we've seen over the past few weeks. Let's wrap up there. Thank you, Barry, for joining me this evening. All very interesting.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to head off now and have a glass of wine with ChatGPT.
Ah, lovely. Well, I should remind you, it doesn't do sexual innuendo until a couple months' time, I think.
Oh,
but
wow.
You can ask it about political ideas, your favorite texts. I'm sure there's enough it can do that will give you a good time. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for watching. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.